Will there be peace in the Middle East? Hardly without a paradigm shift. The third part of the audiobook's three-part edition. Section 6. A backstory from the past and the methods of historical distortions. The USS Liberty Incident, 1967. The USS Liberty Incident, which occurred in 1967, was a tragic and disputed event in Israeli and American relations. The USS Liberty was an American intelligence spy ship, which was attacked by Israeli defense forces in several waves during the Six-Day War. In the attack, 34 American soldiers died, and more than 170 were injured. Israel claimed that the attack was accidental and later paid compensation to the victims' families and the United States for the destroyed technology. Since then, evidence has emerged suggesting that the attack was deliberate, despite it being known that the attack was against an American ship. According to survivors' recollections, during the first wave of the attack, a smaller flag was replaced with a larger one when the opportunity arose amidst the hail of bullets, rockets, and napalm. The survivors are bound by secrecy regarding the circumstances of their decorations. Typically, such decorations are presented by the president at the White House, but in the case of the USS Liberty, it took place in one of the Navy's courtyards, excluding the public. Although the incident caused a serious diplomatic crisis between the two countries, the relationship between the United States and Israel did not deteriorate permanently. In the context of the Cold War, and against the backdrop of Soviet support for Arab countries, the United States continued to regard Israel as a strategic partner. Over the years, the military, intelligence, and diplomatic cooperation between the two countries deepened. Geopolitical interests, shared values, and intertwined strategic objectives all contributed to the continued support of Israel by the United States and other Western countries, despite events that significantly strained the relationship between the two countries. In light of the above lengthy analysis, the Israeli-Palestinian confrontation and the recent atrocities shed light on the complex fabric of indigeneity, colonization, and territorial disputes. The wave of violence in 2023 resulted in significant losses on both sides. Civilians, often caught in the crossfire, continue to bear the brunt of the violence. Neither of the opposing sides truly considers the necessary measures to prevent civilian casualties, thereby exacerbating the long-term crisis and deepening the divide and hatred between communities. Additionally, the escalating conflict resulted in increased settler attacks, evicting hundreds of Palestinians, and highlighting the aspects of colonial efforts. The ongoing construction of settlements in Israeli-occupied West Bank embodies the concept of settler colonization, which remains a central issue in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, although mainstream media focuses less on this part. On the other hand, Israel suffered 54 Palestinian terrorist attacks in 2021, marking an increase compared to the previous year, and serving as a bitter reminder of the cycle of violence prevailing in the region. The hostility and fear caused by such attacks further deepened the divide between Israelis and Palestinians, making a peaceful resolution increasingly difficult, whereas one would expect the opposite in an advanced, civilized world. The reaction of the international community, including the condemning statements of the UN and other bodies, as well as humanitarian consequences, such as restrictions on Palestinian access to health care, limited calorie allowances regarding food supplies, further complicate the situation. In summary, the recent atrocities in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict serve gravely and convincingly as a backdrop to the debate on indigeneity and colonization. The tense situation between Israelis and Palestinians continues to be a vivid example that indigeneity and colonization are not merely academic or theoretical constructs, but have concrete, often devastating effects on the individuals and communities involved in territorial disputes. In the modern digital age, social media has become the battlefield for ideological discourses, among which the Israeli-Palestinian conflict occupies a prominent place. A recurring narrative, often propagated by pro-Israeli factions, supports Zionist ideology as the legitimate foundation of the State of Israel. The aim of this conclusion is to analyze the common arguments put forward by Zionist opporters, revealing a pattern of obfuscation and historical misinterpretation, which seems to conceal the grim reality. Terminology of obfuscation: examining the Israeli-Palestinian confrontation. Applying the terminology of obfuscation in the context of the Israel-Palestine conflict, we can demonstrate how certain groups or entities can hide or distort information in order to promote certain narratives or political objectives. On social media and other online platforms, Zionist or pro-Israeli groups may hide or downplay violence against Palestinian civilians or violations of international law to portray the State of Israel in a better light. Conversely, pro-Palestinian groups may also hide or overlook certain information to promote their own narrative. The distortion of narratives or events can change the perception and understanding of the events depending on ideological or political affiliations. For example, Zionist groups may argue that settlers' activities are legitimate defensive measures, while pro-Palestinian groups regard them as unjust colonial efforts. In online discourse, Zionist or pro-Israeli groups may bring up complex legal or historical arguments to complicate the simple interpretation of the conflict, thereby diverting attention from the fundamental factors of Palestinian oppression. Parties involved may create encrypted arguments or narratives that are only interpretable in certain contexts or with prior knowledge, thus complicating objective analysis and understanding. Through this interpretation, Zionist and pro-Palestinian groups may employ obfuscation tactics to advance their own ideological and political objectives in the Israel-Palestine situation, while distorting or hiding the facts and context that could aid in a more comprehensive and objective understanding of the hostility. A prominent argument posits that historical oppression suffered by Jews, culminating in the Holocaust, somehow legitimizes the colonization of Palestine. This stance collapses upon examination, considering that Palestinians had nothing to do with centuries of European anti-Semitism. Drawing a parallel, it's like claiming that indigenous Australians are entitled to attack Peru in retribution for atrocities committed by Britain and Australia. The absurdity is clear. Historical oppression does not authorize the oppressed to oppress others. Furthermore, it's often argued that a Jewish state in Europe, possibly in Germany, could have served as a more justifiable reparation for the Holocaust. However, Zionists were already propagating the colonization of Palestine and planning the expulsion of its non-Jewish population well before the Holocaust. This indicates opportunism in leveraging a horrific tragedy to advance an existing colonial agenda. Extending this argument leads to the examination of early alliances formed by Zionists, some of whom were European anti-Semites, who saw the Jewish migration to Palestine as a convenient way to rid their own nation of its Jewish population. This contradictory alliance underscores the opportunistic nature of the Zionist colonial enterprise. Venturing into the comparison of Liberia's 19th-century colonization. White Americans, wanting to rid themselves of the growing population of freed black slaves, devised a plan to send them to certain parts of West Africa to colonize. This colonization resulted in a long-standing oppressive regime by Amurako-Liberians over the indigenous population, demonstrating that oppression does not justify further oppression, regardless of historical context. Another argument often brought up in online discussions relates to the presence of about 10,000 Palestinian Jews in Palestine before the onset of Zionist colonization. This fact is brought up to justify mass migration and subsequent colonization, ignoring that the presence of a smaller religious or ethnic group does not grant carte blanche to the world's same religious or ethnic groups to colonize the same territory. The exploration of these arguments reveals a pattern of misleading historical narratives and the blurring of indigeneity principles. It appears that justifications for Zionist colonization often rest on shaky historical interpretations, religious claims, or misinterpretation of ongoing colonial oppression. Section 7. The cycle of power and violence, some thoughts as a closing chord. We live in an era dominated by viral videos and instant news. We are continually confronted with power dynamic scenes unfolding at various points in the world. In these stories, an old new narrative regularly emerges: the perpetual bloodshed in the matter of Israel-Palestine. This never-ending dance of violence, where a rocket shot in the Middle East can spiral into an air raid, breeds further hostility, vengeance, and resistance. The media and the online space's spotlight often cast long shadows that distort the truth and reshape stories, shaping and influencing opinion. In the tragic, violent carousel of the Israeli-Palestinian status quo, defensive moves or retaliatory actions sometimes obscure the original provocative antecedents. Thus, while the media is awash with, and we see and hear these usually portrayed as unprovoked actions, this, coupled with international narrative and unwavering support, led by the United States, often paves the way for endless slaughter, decimating the Palestinian population. Ignoring systemic oppression, such as the careful calorie count allowances for the Gaza Strip, intended to regulate the population's nutrition, and other outrageous methods like damaging water tanks stored on the roofs of Palestinian houses, which settlers shoot at with live ammunition, rendering basic necessities fulfillment impossible or significantly difficult. The alienation game, the antechamber of violence. Nothing facilitates aggression towards others more than when the target is perceived or portrayed as less. This denial of humanity serves as a psychological shield, enabling violence without guilt, or may trigger voluntary aggression from people who were not explicitly asked to act violently, but as governmental and directed communication dehumanizing a group of people identified as targets might prompt them to do so. A great example is the recently publicized announcement by Yoav Gallant about the siege of Gaza. Let's not forget how Zionist extremists and settlers treat their African origin brethren or recently their Christian believer compatriots, emphasizing the land for Jews only theory. Also, remember, not every Zionist is Jewish, and not every Jew is a Zionist, and anti-Zionism is not synonymous with anti-Semitism, which further nuances the complexity of the prevailing situation. Invisible threads, the puppets of systemic problems. Behind these confrontations lie complex, intertwined systemic problems. Whether it's the legacy of the United States' racist past manifesting in today's policing practices, or post-Middle Eastern war land grabs and settler settlements, these threads influence the current narrative. Resounding silence. The lack of accountability. Silence can be as telling as noise. The mild consequences or lack of accountability following overt displays of power showcase a system interwoven with invisible bonds and hidden traits. An example is the globally present thin blue line or elsewhere blue thin line among police forces, where law enforcement colleagues do not testify against each other during criminal investigations, and especially do not report each other, otherwise the individual faces the vilest treatment. This rarely culminates in violence, more often in existential incapacitation of the individual or voluntary reassignment to another unit. Of course, the news follows, so sooner or later the majority find themselves outside the core one way or another. Despite some police and union leaders trying to cast this movement in a positive light to a critical and informed individual, the movement appears more gang-like. The patches placed on uniforms, generally dark-toned, depicting a thin blue line, uniform accessories, and in severe cases body tattoos are signs of gang marking. Those who participate in this clique more frequently find themselves involved in police excessive force, torture, and even life-extinguishing incidents, where the applied violence is not necessarily called for or proportional, but since the chance of getting caught is small due to the lack of available witnesses, this nature of abuse is self-reinforcing and endless, most often ending only with unavoidable accountability. Moreover, force is often applied with the intention that it elicits natural reflex opposition, the instinctive desire to escape from the grasp of unjust violence and dominance. See the vilely provoked physical resisting to provide legal grounds for the fundamentally unjust initiated and applied violence. It's particularly irritating when, for example, in the U.S., such organized, on-duty criminal police groups enriching themselves from crime are busted. Their own gang tattoos within the police units and investigative physical evidence make it obvious what for decades were treated only as hearsay, rumors, or malicious propaganda. Mentioning similarities is only theoretical, and I do not wish to underline the matches, considering the contextual warnings regarding individual historical, political, and social circumstances. However, anyone with a shred of empathic readiness can obviously draw a parallel based on decades of unexecuted international resolutions, war crimes suspected events, and the right-wing force plays, excesses, and their impunity by the Israeli government to the above example. Kaleidoscope motives. Not everything is as it appears. Be it personal prejudices, political agendas, genuine security concerns, or power plays, solitary or isolated fanatic motives, the reasons are layered and often intertwined, and hold unpredictable twists for the future. Epilogue. One can only hope that the increasing number of human casualties will one day force the warring parties towards a peaceful solution, paving the way towards healing, reconciliation, forgiveness, because as impossible and painful as it sounds, no other way is feasible. I stand on the side of innocent victims. Prepared by Jolt Beat Inspector Janasi. Assistant ChatGPT 4 and Murph.ai.